Okay. Well, welcome everyone to today's meet and greet. I see a lot of familiar faces, but if someone hasn't been to the meet and greets before, the meet and greets is a space that we hold and that we've held for several years now since GNPT started. The idea of the meet and greets is precisely what the name says, to meet and greet each other and to meet the people who have the latest examples, the latest knowledge, the latest projects on popular transport, on different areas of popular transport. We've had different partners in implementing these meet and greets, and for the last year and a half, around a year and a half, we've been hosting these meet and greets jointly with PRISM, which is the Partnership for Research on Informal and Shared Mobility. It's funded and supported by VREF. Jackie here is the coordinator of that partnership. And we have Hayne from WRI here also from the research partnership. And we engage also with other people from the GNPT network who are doing amazing work on pop transport. So that's why here we have our colleagues from Transport for Cairo who will be speaking a bit later on the work that we're doing on climate action and decarbonizing and making pop transport more sustainable. So we wanted to talk about climate action in the pop transport sector. Why? Because we believe there's an enormous potential for the pop transport sector to be part of this decarbonization transition, but also that we need to make sure that this transition is just and it doesn't leave the pop transport sector behind, but also because we're aware that this sector is highly vulnerable to a lot of different aspects, including the climate crisis. So today we're going to be talking about some of the data that is out there to help us better understand what that decarbonization potential is. What are the main challenges and what is the reality depending on different regions, and also what types of policy and action we can take to decarbonize and adapt the pop transport sector. Just in context, the transport sector right now contributes around 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And it's one of the fastest growing sectors around the world. And it's growing steadily. And the latest IPCC report that reviewed the global emissions said that if we want to get on track with the Paris Agreement goals of reducing emissions and to hopefully not get them above 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels, we need to reduce our emissions and then the trajectory by at least 60%. So that reduction is very, very big. And if we only focus on formal government provided services or on private vehicles, it's not going to be enough. The data that the OECD recently released was that if the same measures that are being applied for government provided public transport were applied to popular transport, this was particularly minibuses, but we can extrapolate from there. 4% of global transport emissions could be reduced. And that's only if we model minibus taxis. So imagine the potential that we could have if we invested and if we applied efforts to decarbonize and ensure this transition to the pop transport sector. And we don't have to only imagine it. That's why we're here to share the examples of how this is being done in different places around the world, and so we can learn from each other. So I'm gonna go ahead and give the floor to Carlos. Carlos is part of our shared use mobility / global network for popular transportation team. And Carlos, he led the development of the SLOCAT chapter on informal transport for the Transport, Climate, and Sustainability Global Status Report. This report brings global data on the status of transport, climate, and sustainability. And now we have a chapter dedicated specifically to popular transport. So Carlos, if you're around, Please introduce yourself and share your screen.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrea. Hello, everyone. I'm Carlos Gonzalez, a program associate with the Shared Use Mobility Center. And we are going to be sharing a little bit of our work that we did for this LOCAT Global Status Report. Let me know if you can see my screen correctly.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Yeah, so this report was done in support with Andrea and also Christian from the Shared Use Mobility Center. And today we mostly wanted to highlight some of the key insights and findings, primarily related to climate action, but the report covers a breadth of different topics for the informal transport chapter. So I wanted to start just by sharing a bit about the report itself. It's meant to be sort of a aggregation of the latest available data, any business or policy developments in the field as well, with the hopes of providing decision makers for a one-stop shop for uh, latest developments and hopefully um, provide knowledge for faster, bolder action in the transport sector. So the chapter in the overall report, it has some scheduled releases of sections. However, the informal transport chapter is set to be released in around September of this year. So I wanted to first start just by sharing some of the data that we have on demand and emission trends. One of the main findings, as you may know, is that there's a lack of data in the field, just specifically about the use of informal transportation, in particularly some standardized data across different cities, right? We've come across a lot of different aggregations for this data, and it's usually presented as either percentage of work trips or vehicle kilometers traveled, or just overall market share of informal transportation. But here on the right, you may see some of the cities that we included on the report. This mostly come from the Mobilize Your City sums, as well as some other sources. In this year's edition, we found that amongst these cities, the average was about 48% of trips or vehicles kilometers traveled were done using informal transport, with some cities having more than 70% of all the trips done through informal transportation. One of the main and key insights from this data is also the considerable differences in the use of informal transportation and also the share of emissions that this represents. So I want to point your attention to Ambato, Ecuador, and also Dakar, Senegal, which have about a similar share of trips, about 34%. However, the share of emissions that informal transportation represents as part of the transport sector is vastly different. And this is sort of related to both the age and the modes that are dominant in those areas as well, with Ecuador having some newer minibuses. Now for some modal and regional insights. We've noticed that two and three wheelers continue with the trend uh, of dominating this market in Asia. Digitalization and integration efforts. Some of the apps, Uber, Gojek, have fostered both electrification initiatives and also the market for two and three wheelers. And another interesting insight was that secondhand motorcycles remain prevalent in certain regions. This insight comes from the Lubyansa Research Group quarterly reports, which is a resource that I would invite you to check out. These are observational studies carried out in Uganda. Um, and through their observations, they noticed that more than 50% of the boda bodas in the region were secondhand. And they also provide some other interesting insights, which I think are interesting when evaluating other things such as digitalization and integration. One of them is that 1 out of every 3 drivers use some form of social media, which is an indicator of how digitalized some of the actors in the sector are. With regards to minibus taxis, they remain the backbone of urban mobility in many cities. 70 to 80% of work trips in some cities are carried out using minibus taxis, as we saw with Ambato, Ecuador, and also South Africa as well in some cities. They have a huge potential for emissions reductions, in particular due to some of these being older vehicles. One of the case studies that we shared was Mexico City scrappage of old buses. And in some of their data, they shared that the average age of those vehicles was more than 30 years, which, as you may know, are going to be more polluting vehicles. Lastly, for other modes, we noticed that for boats, clandestine taxis, and pickups, the data remains a lot more scarce. And this is particularly due to, as some papers highlight, the dynamics and relations between operators, uh, researchers, and also government entities, potentially related due to the level of formality of the service. Most of the data that we found for these modes comes from journalistic reporting, observational studies. One of the case studies that we shared was the Gulf of Fonseca boats around the region of Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador in Central America, where on average 400 people were using the boats per day to travel within the area between the islands and mainland Central America. With regards to policy and business development, one of the main case studies that we found, as I mentioned, was that of Mexico City. Um, a part of this was the Aztecas corridor, which is part of a bigger citywide effort for scrappage and replacement of vehicles. In this case, 97 diesel older vehicles were replaced by just 28 electric trolley buses, which helped with a 74% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. Similarly, some of the government incentives, FAME 2 scheme in India, which has now aided in reaching 6% of overall vehicle registrations for electric rickshaws. And something interesting that we've seen is that when these countrywide efforts are implemented, also individual local governments are incentivized to implement a lot of these programs themselves. So we hope to see some of that traction continue as well. With regards to private sector initiatives, as you know, accessible financing remains a big challenge, but we've seen a lot of interesting initiatives come up. For instance, in Kenya with pay-as-you-go leasing for e-matatus, Green Wheels in Africa, which are providing fixed income for the drivers and also the vehicles as well. Some of the other initiatives in Rwanda as well are solar-powered battery swapping stations. As you know, that still remains a challenge with regards to electrification and the current infrastructure available in certain countries. Lastly, one of the main topics that we discussed was recognition in NDC, or nationally determined contributions. And we're happy that Somalia recently announced also that they included a goal to promote electric and energy efficient vehicles, specifically tuk-tuks. Before that, we had only seen Uganda and Angola sort of consider or briefly mention informal transportation in their NDCs. With Uganda proposing the electrification of boda bodas, and Angola recognizing the contribution of candongueiros. Um, Andrea, I don't know if there's anything you also wanted to share about that part.
Sure. So the importance of having pop transport in goals in the NDCs is key so that we can get support and leverage funding and technical assistance, etc., for to continue the work of decarbonizing, changing technologies, supporting the workers, etc. Right now, we're right now at the in the process of different countries updating their nationally determined contributions, which are essentially the contributions that each country commits to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change, and they're required to update these contributions and these intentions every 5 years. So we hope that more countries will have included pop transport in these 2025 versions. Only a few have already submitted, and we're glad to see Somalia having included tuk-tuks there. And that's also the reason why we jointly with Transport for Cairo developed this NDC template to provide guidance and examples to countries on how they can include popular transport in their new NDCs. So this is only the start of seeing more countries include this in their NDCs. And once it is in a national policy as the NDC, and it's also an international commitment, there's also the opportunity for countries to leverage funding and leverage support to actually be able to achieve these contributions and this commitment. So that's why it's so important that they are documented in the NDC, because that's how they can afterwards go to their regional banks or work with international cooperation and say, hey, this is a goal for me to decarbonize my economy and my transport sector. Can you help me implement these goals? Or is there a way we can set up a facility to finance the electrification? Or is there a way we can have technical cooperation to support in the shift in business models, et cetera, et cetera? So that's why it's so important that these are incorporated in the NDCs so that policy can start coming down into actual actions on the ground.
Thank you, Andrea. Um, Last, I just wanted to share some brief gaps and next steps that we found in this work. Primarily, for me, it was data and standards. Um, as I pointed out in the beginning, there is a need for standardization of data collection, right? Mobilize Your City recently put out a new tool and just some more guidance on how to integrate informal transportation into GHG calculations, which, as they mentioned, if not done at all or appropriately, can lead up to a 40% oversight in these calculations. Similarly, is the understanding and the impact of digitalization and integration. We saw primarily with the 2- and 3-wheeler market how the use of apps, the integration of informal transportation in apps has helped the market, but there is currently a lack of understanding of just what share of vehicles, right, are used for this purpose. Lastly, and one of the main challenges is accessible and properly designed financing. Uh, and just to provide better understanding of what do operators need, how can local government support this, and also provide some more guidance to any private initiatives that are helping achieve this as well. And yeah, thank you so much. This was a brief overview of the report, which we hope that you will get a chance to look at in the upcoming months. But this is, as you know, the second edition of the informal transport chapter. If you haven't had a chance yet, I would invite you to go check out some of the information that is already available in the SLOCAT website as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. We really wanted to share this information with you even before the final draft of the chapter is released, because I think it's really exciting information to frame this conversation, right? In really understanding if we want to decarbonize transport in a city like the ones we saw in the graph, well, this actually has the potential to reduce up to 40% of the whole transport emissions in that city. So like the potential is really enormous, but then there's also a big potential in terms of improving livelihoods for the people involved in the sector and reducing vulnerabilities and improving connectivity for the whole city itself. So there's a lot of social and economic dimensions that are associated to decarbonizing the sector that are really important to take into consideration. And that's why we also include the just transition element into this conversation, right? And how we can do this and go beyond just a technology shift, but talk about people, the people involved. How are we going to take care of them in this transition, right? It's not only about electrifying vehicles. So that's something we need to keep in mind moving forward. So now that we have like the wider understanding of how the sector is looking like, I wanted to call in our colleagues from Transport for Cairo to tell us a bit about, okay, if a country would want to start incorporating policy on popular transport within their climate action efforts, how can they start? If they wanted to incorporate pop transport in their NDCs, and if they're in this process, what could they add there? What guidance is out there, and how can these efforts look like? So I'll give the floor to Farida and Abdul Rahman to present, and go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Are you able to see my screen okay? Yeah?
Yep.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. So yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to join the meet and greet and to present some of our work that we've been doing on climate action, sustainability, and just transition for popular transport. We all, I think many of us know each other here, but for those who don't know Transport for Cairo, we're a strategic advisory practice. We've been around for about 10 years, and we have 4 different teams, but that work very strategically together. We have the Data Lab, who's headed by Abdurrahman Maliki, who will be speaking in a minute, the Urban Mobility Lab that's headed by me, the tech team that enables all of the data and research work and capacity building work that we do, as well as a team dedicated towards ensuring passenger information systems are up to date, usable, and available, especially in cities of the global south. Without going into too many details, I wanted to highlight the relevant publications that we've recently put out that are talking about today's topic, specifically, the climate dimension with regards to popular transport. And in chronological order, perhaps we, together with GNPT and with the kind support of Tumi, and I'm glad to see Keisha online as well, we've put out a background paper establishing the link between the climate discussion and popular transport in the global scene. And then we've developed a template, a global NDC template for popular transport. And on the far right, you will see our latest publication, which just came out, that aims to localize these recommendations that we've put out to the context of Cairo. And Reda will jump in for a minute to explain about that before we then head off to hear more about data projects with Abdurrahman. So the NDC template, the main objective here was to, as Andrea hinted earlier, to recognize that there is very significant decarbonization potential for the popular transport sector within the overall transport sector. And the reason being that we saw that many of the national policies and strategies don't include popular transport targets, and they're more often, if at all, found on the local levels only. The template, as I just mentioned, is a joint effort, and the objective also was to make sure that it is used as a reference material for countries in preparation of their NDCs 3.0. We had a very rigorous methodology there where we established a case studies group, an advisory committee, and a peer reviewer group. And I'm very happy to also see, of course, Jacqueline with us and Hein with us, who were part of the peer reviewer group. In total, we consulted over 20 experts, combining both the climate angle as well as the transport angle, and especially also people who had this advisory role and strategic background with dealing with national governments, feed into this NDC template. As you may have probably heard, estimates from GNPT show that 70% of road transport trips are done using popular transport, and therefore enormous potential to reduce emissions. Also, the study Andrea just referred to, about 12% of emissions would be able to be reduced if we would apply the same amounts of improvement measures to minibuses as we do standard buses. And with that in mind, we really wanted to, basically put some recommendations out there on how to decarbonize popular transport. Looking into the NDCs that had already been submitted, we saw that there were only 2 countries who have mentions or actions towards popular transport, with Angola mentioning, and Uganda basically calling for the electrification of boda-bodas, which I believe Carlos also hinted at earlier. However, when we compare this to NDCs related to public transport, for example, there's a lot more to be done there, and that called for having this NDC template. Further, we wanted to make sure to join an overall sectoral effort. So in the past year, a number of transport templates have been published by different transport organizations that are also advocating for more sustainable mobility. So there was the active travel template by the PATH Coalition. There's a rail NDC template by UIC. There's a public transport template by UITP. And then after those 3 had been published, we basically worked on the popular transport template while following the same structure and assessment guidelines they had. And then these 4 modal templates were basically combined and presented in a more comprehensive and strategic way in the ITF guide up there on the right. But basically the assessment is very straightforward. And that is also what helped us in structuring the NDC template. Do NDCs mention popular transport? Who oversees the process of working on the popular transport sector? Are there any clear timeframes? How ambitious are the targets? Do we talk about mitigation or adaptation? What are the concrete actions? Is there a funding plan? And are there some monitoring and evaluation frameworks available for the targets and actions or not? We came up with a vision statement on how we would imagine popular transport to be, and based on that, on a number of objectives that then guide the actions and recommendations that are presented. The 4 overarching objectives are data collection and maintenance. So if we don't measure the popular transport sector, then we won't be able to improve it. And that is, so to say, a prerequisite for doing anything related to the popular transport sector. Secondly, recognizing and integrating popular transport services. More often than not, governments are more concerned with launching or deploying modern public transport services and completely oversee or choose to ban popular transport services. So here in the template, we basically call for recognition and acknowledgement of the services that they provide, their importance, and the fact that they have been doing so without any government support most of the time. And we then call for different ways that these services can be integrated to become more professional, to become more aligned with also the expected quality standards that perhaps the government wants to push for. And of course, clean vehicles. So how do we phase out these very often old vehicles that are used for popular transport and gradually phasing out ICE-based vehicles? And also quite important is, of course, just transition and adaptation. So making sure that the transition is quite inclusive and fair, considering the well-being of not only public transport workers, but also users, and reducing the vulnerability and that they face, and that is an actual, not just threat, but a current reality in the face of climate change. And basically after we published that, we went straight into advocacy and capacity building, where through a UITP workshop, we already started disseminating and advocating for these actions with the local transport authority in Cairo, the Land Transport Regulatory Authority, who are currently in the process of trialing and building a BRT system on the ring road. And there, the narrative was basically, we will ban all of the microbuses currently serving the ring road and replace them with BRT. And through this training and other advocacy activities, we kept, trying to advocate for more integration and recognition. And now the narrative actually changed to, we will not ban them, but we will use them as feeders to and from the ring road where the BRT will operate. So small win, and hopefully more to come. Further, I mentioned there's a new publication. Reda, I see you're online. If you could jump in, say a quick word, and then we hand over to Abdurrahman.
Yes, thank you, Farida. So very quickly in this publication, we were able to maybe take it another way through to the NDCs. So we basically performed a localization activity of the different templates, including the GNPT TFC template, where we were trying to see how the upcoming NDC could apply some of the guidelines mentioned across the different templates. And how we did that is that through three main recommendations. We had a set of 26 recommendations for the government that hopefully, fingers crossed, they could endorse in the upcoming NDC. And we were inspired, of course, by the template, and this started by, as Farida mentioned, measuring the amount of emissions, and this happens by data collection and evaluating the impact that comes from the different popular transport fleet we have in Cairo and even across Egypt on the longer term. So one of the steps we were thinking about is maybe the first thing that the government needs to acknowledge, that you need to calculate how much is coming from this sector. And if you put that in the NDCs, it could be the first step. You say that we know that how much is coming from there, because if it's not calculated, they cannot actually acknowledge the amount that is coming. The second is just transition and adaptation. And this is where we were trying to pull, maybe through the guidelines or the recommendations, is creating dialogue. Like Farida mentioned, it's a win that they would say that the popular transport will act as feeders, but there is more dialogue needed when it comes to working conditions and the labor regulations that happens when it relates to this kind of service. So also in the NDC, we were recommending that create a dialogue, know what are the working conditions, the labor regulations, and also control measures. So we were trying to be as practical as we can. So maybe control measures in the stations where both public and popular transportation operate. And finally, the clean vehicles. And maybe Egypt had previous experiences with that. So we were thinking about maybe put this in the NDC, add an enforcement mechanism of vehicle renewal plans for popular transport. And when this becomes part of the NDC, it could be easier to advocate for, get financing for. And of course, this comes as part of us putting the guidelines out there, but it still needs the government to endorse these kinds of recommendations, to put them there in their NDCs, which we hope they would by the end of this year. Back to you, Farida.
Thank you, Reda. With that, we jump right into Abdurrahman's part. Please go ahead, Abdurrahman.
Thank you, Farida. So we're going to talk about two use cases from Cairo and Maputo from recent work we've done using data in the context of just transition. And we start with Cairo, the case of Cairo, which Farida just mentioned, and Ring Road BRT, which is currently in its first phase of operation. The ring road, as you can see, it's huge. It's almost like 8 lanes on each side. So the BRT is supposed to go circular on the full ring road. That's about 120 kilometers in length. It encloses or encompasses inner Cairo and inner Giza. So you're talking about maybe 20 million, the population, around 20 million people. Currently, from the images on the right, these are the kinds of feeders slash modes that operate on the ring road. We have like those pickup trucks, we call them boxes, but mainly the image on the bottom, the microbuses, which some call matatus and minibus taxis, the 14-seaters, and tuk-tuks, auto rickshaws. Next slide, please, Farida. So the mentality before the BRT, before our study and before the BRT project implementation from the Ministry of Transport, the statement, the public statement is there will be no more subsidies for public transport in Egypt. The tickets won't be subsidized anymore. And also in regards to the BRT on the ring road, the Ministry of Transport declared that there will be no microbuses allowed to operate on the ring road once the BRT starts operations. Next slide, please. So first finding from the study we did, 151 microbus routes overlap the ring road with over 3 kilometers. So we're talking about routes that will be severely affected, and there were more, but those are the ones that traverse the ring road for a longer distance. Next slide, please, Farid. Also regarding the user experience before the BRT, this is how it looks like. So people wait on the side of the road, which is a highway. And you can see also the feeder modes, they have kind of like a small terminal on that highway, which you have vehicles going on very high speeds. These are the kinds of entrances and exits on the ring road, because again, it's a highway. It wasn't supposed to have any pedestrian activity, but people make these entrances and exits because of accessibility and the need for better mobility. So these makeshift wooden ladders is another example where the ring road is elevated. So people do make these kinds of steps. Of course, no safety whatsoever. When we did passenger surveys, over 10,000 passenger surveys for people using the ring road across male, female, low-income groups, all groups agree that cost and fare is one of the top 3 considerations. So that's the context here in Cairo. And when we studied the current state, we found that people on average pay about 0.4 EGP per kilometer traveled for their full trip when they go from origin to destination. And when we looked at just the microbus routes that go on the ring road, the ones I mentioned, 121, those charge about 0.27 EGP per kilometer. The difference in number comes from exchanging different modes. You take more than one bus, and so you pay more and so on. Next slide, please, Farida. So LTRA, we have to give credit to the leadership at the time of the Land Transport Regulatory Authority, because they asked us this question. They thought that if we're going to have a BRT on the ring road, if you want to provide people with a different service, people can't be paying more than the current microbus fare. We can't enforce that. Also, there's a bit of history that, there's more detail behind that. But in short, today, the first phase of the BRT operates at 35 kilometers from the 120 kilometers, 35. So 14 stations, you'd have to pay 15 EGP, which is 0.42, 0.43 EGP per kilometer. So they took at least this consideration into account of the cost and fare. So what do we have today? First of all, the BRT is quote unquote subsidized. It had to be subsidized, at least for now. Second, enforcement against the microbuses were not sustainable. And they're tolerated today. So the first phase of the BRT operating, you have microbuses running along them. There was no enforcement so far. And we want to highlight that more tolerance towards the microbuses by the government does not necessarily mean inclusion. And of course, we can talk about that. Plus, integrated ticketing is necessary to ensure affordability for the passengers, because you have so many passengers in this particular case exchanging more than once. Farida, maybe. So that's the summary from Cairo. We go to another case study in Maputo. Again, we have BRT that's soon to be implemented. They don't have the pilot yet, but soon to be implemented. And if we look at the map on the right, we have all these blue shades of blue. These are the existing Chapa and municipal bus and cooperative bus routes that operates on the different corridors in Maputo. And those colored dark lines are is the proposed BRT network. So the proposed BRT network phase 1 will replace all of these services. So what we were tasked by the World Bank, and we collaborated with the GLI, Global Labor Institute, on this. We were tasked to find out the market share and asset ownership of the existing operators. That's one thing. And second was to assess the impact on the workforce, so workforce assessment. And third is the valuation of affected entities. And here, the idea is to think of the operators, the association operating these Chapa routes and the bus routes as a bit of like corporates. What's their value? Which is already you have to make a lot of assumptions to try to fit this structure into that. So yeah, what we did, what we know how to do best is we assessed the service level from the ground, from the field, and we calculated the revenue from operations, route by route, on the weekday, on the weekend. We combined this field data with questionnaires and focus group discussions made with the operators, with GLI, to find out the revenue per driver. So we start to look into the operators' daily and annual revenue. Next slide, please, Farid. But we're talking revenue, we're talking income from ridership. But when we go into the details, as GLI did, just this example, we look at okay, what are the operators paying as expenses? And we see that you have so many variabilities. Every single person you talk to, either they are a driver owner, or they're an owner of a couple of fleets, or they're just for hire drivers. And then they pay, some have loans, some have to pay like bribes for the police or parking. So many variables that you stop here at trying to quantify the profit, which is the valuation, so to speak. So next slide, please. So in short, this attempt at trying to compensate or trying to integrate the existing operators, at least financially, some things were feasible, such as the estimating the ridership, estimating the revenue, but the representation of individual operators, those that didn't belong to associations, those were not represented. So it's very hard to represent, to include them in these figures. The operating expenses, as we mentioned, were very variable. And so we were not able to come up with figures for profit. And this also has to do with the difficulty in mapping the assets, the vehicles and the other kind of assets that they have. So quantifying the value of popular transport operations, while it's possible, but you have to make very conservative, you have to be very conservative about estimations, and you have to have a very high degree of sampling in the interviews and the field surveys you're doing. And it's non-scalable in our opinion, or maybe it's scalable over a long period of time. So from those two experiences, our conclusion is this for now. Just transition as a term for popular transport, it's still a maturing concept. We're still learning there. Number two, while data is very valuable, but it cannot replace the need for comprehensive stakeholder consultations, which takes time and effort. It's hard to quantify everything. Third finding is that deep-rooted existing institutional challenges, such as the lack of operator visibility, fair integration, fair setting mechanisms, and so on, will hinder a just transition. It will not be addressed merely by introducing a new transport mode, in this case, the BRT. You have to resolve these issues first. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the Transport for Cairo team for this presentation. I think a lot of the times when we talk about climate action and policy and transformation, we tend to focus on the what, what needs to be done, and these are the actions, but not necessarily on the how. And the how is where the nuances are and where we need to go very much in detail and have data and a good understanding on how this can look like in different contexts. Because as we saw in Carlos's presentation, the context, the vehicles, the governance, the organization, it all kind of has an impact on, at the end of the day, the emissions or how we need to approach it, right? So I'm really thankful that this presentation had a little bit of the what's, but then we focused on the how and how it's very different in different places. And just to kickstart your heads into the conversation ahead, I think we're seeing in a lot of places around the world and for several decades now that the only moment where governments tend to look at the popular transportation sector and start measuring it and try to get a better understanding is when there's a BRT project coming up. And popular transport is present overwhelmingly in so many different places, and they're not all big cities. And they're not all places where a BRT can work. So just some food for thought also on how we can, and then this is on an ongoing conversation that we have within our groups, but also to try to get it to the different people who are here joining us today. How can we start having these conversations on measuring, better understanding, supporting that just transition in places where there might not be a BRT project, where there's funds to study all of this, right? It's wonderful to get the opportunity to measure all of this and get that data if there's a project like this, but we also need to do it in other contexts. But going beyond that, usually when we talk climate, the center of the conversation is mitigation, right? How can we reduce emissions? How can we try to prevent that increase, that global increase of greenhouse gas emissions from the sector? But there is a very big component that's usually missing in these conversations, and it's adaptation, because the climate crisis is already here. And usually the impacts of this crisis is the impacts of the different, how it looks like, and these impacts in different places are usually suffered the most by people who already have certain levels of vulnerability. So usually the poorer populations, the ones that have been excluded from urban transport planning, the people who operate in informality, those people are usually the most impacted by climate. And that is the case for a lot of the workers and even the users of popular transport. So we wanted to invite Hein from WRI to give us some insights on a recent publication that they produced jointly also with Jackie and with Prism, based on what we're seeing on regarding adaptation and what are the missing conversations that we need to have on how to better support the sector in terms of climate adaptation. So Hein, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Can you see me? So can you see the slide?
Can hear you and see you clearly.
Okay. Thank you. So thanks for the introduction. I'm Hein I go by the middle one, and then from World Resources Institute. We are a global environmental think tank, and so we do stuff related to forest, energy, climate, oceans, water. But I sit in the cities and then do things do sustainable stuff from the Angles of Cities program and cities and transportation. So as Andrea mentioned, this was published in May with colleagues from Prism and a bunch of and that was launched at ITF in May 20 this year. The climate is the highlights of this paper is climate disruption is here, how it's impacting critical transport mode. So as the colleagues from Transport for Cairo said, like the people are like the users are trying to get from point A to point B, and then you have all these operators, driver, transport workers trying to like survives or maximize their revenue, sustain their livelihoods, and then you still have to also deal with law enforcement. The adaptation might not be in everybody's like a forefront. Also, we also heard from Carlos about how the transport sector is like stubborn and substantial in terms of carbon emissions, but the climate disruption is already here, so we should also start thinking in tandem to mitigations about reducing GHG emissions, the adaptations. How do we live in this new reality? So this is also in some way important to avoid this like login, like a vicious circle where the declining infrastructures are propelling to more higher emitting vehicle modes and then undermining low carbon future. So it's related. Adaptation is important for mitigation and vice versa. So that's one of the major messages of this policy brief. In the brief, we look at mainly two different angles: extreme heats and flooding, because those are the most common one in the cities that we work in with the PRISM that's led by Columbia University, the consortiums. So those are the two different hazards that we look at and the risk related to that, and we review local climate action plans, adaptation plans, and then see to what extent these address popular transport mode. So this is more of a like a preliminary scoping exercise of what exists in the literature at the from the adaptation lens particularly, and then one of the key message of this is this is also echoing Benji Talapino, who's here, said like instead of looking more from the deficit angle, we should be thinking of this as investments, which also what the Transport for Cairo show a little bit of. So what are the, like, if you are thinking them as a potential untapped access, then we want to invest more in those as part of this more sustainable future. So the two framework, I guess this is coming from the avoid, should, improve. This is maybe a lot of people are familiar with in terms of like reducing decarbonization agenda. So you avoid an unnecessary private trip, and then maybe you plan the cities more coordinated and compact, and shifting to more sustainable modes such as public transports and walking and cycling, and improving the vehicle efficiency, fuel efficiency. So they might not be like, you could think of those instead of just side by side, you could think of more as a pyramid where the avoid will require a lot more structural changes, where improving fuel efficiency, the most prominent example is electrification, is more technology, and it will probably need less inertia. And then if you're trying to make a structural change by avoiding and shift, that will require more investments and then improvements in that. That's one framework, and we're trying to see how that might map to adaptations and mitigations angle. Mitigation, again, to reduce emissions that cause climate change, and then adaptation, broadly defined as the actions to manage the risk of climate change impacts. The other framework that we look at, which is coming from IPCC, this is maybe slightly older version of 2022. I mean, yeah, that's a bit more expanded version. You are looking risks from three angles, like the hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. So the hazards, like, because that's kind of the quote here kind of summarize that. How hot is too hot? It depends on how exposed and vulnerable we are. That those three angles define the risk, and then the initial framework is to shrink these circles, to shrink the hazard, to shrink the vulnerability, and then to shrink the exposure to reduce the risk, I guess. Again, in this paper, we only look at the heat and flooding issues, but the UNDRR has a list. United Nations Disaster Risk Management had 282 hazards grouped into 8 hazard types. So this is considered part of the hydrological and meteorological. But there are other issues like biological COVID. It's a good example. How do we make sure our transport systems are resilient to these different types of hazards and risks? We did kind of do some of like tracings of how extreme heat might be impacting this popular transport. So we divide that into 2 different big categories, like how that affect the infrastructures and access, and then how that might affect the health and operational impacts. So in the heat is usually considered a silence killer because you might be fine, but you might think you're fine, but that's melting, and then that's gonna affect these access, and then that's also affect the user, and then the user experience probably vary by gender, age, socioeconomic condition. So women, if they feel like they are if it's too hot of a condition, but then if they're trying to where in a particular way they might be exposed to additional risk of like if the society perceive they're too exposing or whatever. That's kind of some of the what literatures are saying, and then or people might not be avoiding trips if they can, if they have or they might be losing the access if they need to get things done. That's same with the service providers. That's broadly defined, and the revenues might be decreased. There might be a mode shift, and then that's causing going from these buses and minibus to maybe more private vehicle. That again, that will affect the lower carbon future. So and then there's also a difference between 4-wheelers versus 2-wheelers. Again, this is like a high level mapping, and then a more detailed research in specific locations is needed to better understand all these different dynamics and distributional impacts on different user and access. Flooding is more complicated in terms of modeling than heat, I was told. But again, it's the same, the mapping here and how that might affect into the whole ecosystem, looking for from the infrastructures and operations and health and well-being of the user. There is these researchers stay very new recent. There's only a small group of people doing the research that we could find. Like in the Philippines, there were studies about how how users are. I think it was in Manila, not just jeepney, but all the different modes, looking at how the user mode shifts or not shift depending on their occupational status. So there are a few studies, but it's not as the literature is not as large as say electrifications, which partly because the transport being a huge, what Jackie's was steppins and substantial in terms of trying to decarbonize. But there are slowly but growing research on the adaptation center in the transport sector. So these are summary of some of the climate action plans that we look at. These are the 7 cities that the Prison Lab have like a university base, and then the local scholars help us with collecting these documents and also give input to us. So it's been enriching and edifying experience. So again, we look at in these documents, are there any medications in adaptation, the split, and then if there's like a specific descriptions of popular transport. Those are the 2 main things we look at in these documents. as you can see, it varies in terms of how the popular transport is describes or recognized. In Accra, Cape Town, Mumbai, there are recognitions of the sector, and then there is also plan of what that means for the future, like Accra, for example. There is a plan for BRT, like a feeder service system with the total system. But motorcycle taxis are banned in the city, even though they are, I mean, officially banned, but they still exist and operate. So it's when I talk to people from Accra and Kumasi, mitigation usually it's coming in the transport sector very clearly, but adaptations is sprinkled in different like topics. It could be under the water management, even though there's a transport component in there. Or it could be in other cross-cutting areas. The Accra has like one explicit transport-related adaptations about how to construct to construct shaded sidewalks that's going into the bus system. So that's rare, but in terms of adaptation, they usually came under in a different sectoral things. So that's to give you like examples of what I meant. So like you see like sustainable mobility. This is the Mumbai plan. You see what most of these are related to medication plan, but and then you have all these different pieces that might be related to like a transport adaptations in the other different sectoral priorities. This is the land surface temperatures of this one from the climate action plan. One major criticism of this Mumbai climate action plan was this boundary. This is the boundaries of I forgot the exact term, but instead of considering this boundary, the metropolitan, there are also other people living around this area, and maybe popular transport mode like auto rickshaws are more prevalent, and then all these settlements are more prevalent in this area. But because they drew the boundary this way, that's kind of exclude the larger area in the Mumbai. That seems to be the main criticisms of inclusion exclusion conversations. Even though this is one of the most well done climate action plans in terms of stakeholder engagements, and then so further research questions. Andrea talked about how, but I think in this case we're trying to understand about the different impacts and interactions. That's at least that's how we came up with. So how does this different cascading and compounding, like if you are in a place like Bangkok, you can have both heat and flooding in a singular day. I mean, that's probably also true in Mumbai, depending on the season. So how does it affect entire intermodal transport systems, both the formal and the popular modes? We need to have a better understanding of that, and we need to have a better understanding of the impact on the specific transport services. Are they doing well? Are they not doing well? Both the entire system as well as specific systems. And then how are these popular services adapting? What are the popular bottom-up strategy that can be supported? So we've seen like in the rainy day, like people like the transport operator, that's also credit to Andrea, using all these WhatsApp to communicate, coordinate. So I mean it's and then like I've also seen like great literature in India where you have fans and water in the heating things. Are there other strategies that exist, and then that can be supported more with more climate action plans? And then, yeah, another like a distributional impact is how does these climate hazards impact different user groups and modes? So it's not gonna be the same. Like if it's a really hot day, instead of taking a rickshaw, if you have enough money, you would just take an air conditioned taxi. Uh, so we need to have a better understanding of that, and this is more of a scoping exercise, looking at this particular intersection at the adaptation and also at the popular transport. Thank you. Thanks, Jackie. This is our second author. So do you have any words? I don't know, Jackie, if you want to say anything.
Well, I won't right now about this specifically, but yeah. But I think I'll probably make a few comments when Andrea invites me. But thank you, Hein. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Hein. I think we really wanted to have the adaptation component into this conversation because at the end of the day, if we're thinking about the future of our cities, it won't really matter if we completely electrify all of our fleets if our city and our systems are vulnerable and they can't even navigate the flooding or the heat that is going on, right, in different places. So I really liked your reflection at the end on how this is about how we ensure the resilience of entire multimodal systems. The problem is that oftentimes when we talk about these multimodal systems, the pop transport modes are not reflected there. So I think that's why our advocacy is important, right? In trying to get popular transport to be recognized as part of these multimodal systems. And then once we look at the resilience of the system, be able to look at the differences and the particularities on how to ensure both the decarbonization, but also the adaptation and resilience of these different modes. So definitely a lot to do. We will not be bored in the upcoming decades. Also, just a heads up that starting this year, we're going to start the UN Decade of Sustainable Transport. So having these conversations on how to make pop transport more sustainable and more resilient has to be part of the conversation on what types of actions we're going to take in this next decade to make global transport more sustainable. So thanks everyone for these framing presentations. Now I'm going to invite Jackie to kick us off with her insights, comments, and we can have a conversation. We have about 20 minutes left to just have conversation, questions, exchanges, etc. So go ahead, Jackie. I'll let you spark our minds first, and then we can have questions.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you so much for these fantastic presentations and the really important work you're doing. It's such an amazing gaping hole that these modes that do so many trips and carry so many people were really outside of the climate conversation. And so that's quite a remarkable hole in our efforts to address the climbing emissions from the transport sector. And also emissions that contribute to air pollution in cities that are very adverse to our health. And so I think it's just an incredible achievement, and I just want to really thank you for that. And it's kind of remarkable that from a technical point of view, it's extremely irresponsible not to measure how these modes operate and to understand them and to measure their emissions and their impacts, as well as how they're being impacted by climate. So there's an incredibly strong technical reason for us to be doing this work, besides obviously the care for the people and the justice issues. So my main question really is about what was mentioned about the framing and the narrative and the consultations. And Andrea, what you were saying about, like, we know that there are things that can be done. There's the technical side of it where we have a variety of ways that we can improve these systems and how they connect to our public transport systems. But the how do we start to shift the politics and honestly the money also, that resources are actually going into addressing emissions and adaptation problems, and also the integration. And you know, there's a really optimistic case, as you were sort of suggesting, that if we actually included this sector as partners and also in our calculations and in our strategies, we could really have an impact that's beneficial to everybody at multiple scales. But it seems like right now, even though that is very clear for most of us here, it's a struggle to get change. And so my question is, I'd love some reflections from the different teams on what kinds of, how did you use your data? How did you use your reports? I mean, we got to, and what kinds of stories did you tell that seemed to be impactful? And here, I think, Maliki, your case studies were really, you know, and Farida, the case studies from Transport for Cairo were really, really compelling. So I was wondering if everyone wants to talk a little bit about that struggle, because it is so important. We need to talk about it more. And I do want to just finally say that also some of the like solutions for, or the ways that we can improve things can have multiple benefits, and we're really need to maybe bring some of all this work together to think about the cost benefit analysis of some of the potential interventions. And I want to make a plug for air pollution. I think we need to start connecting to the air pollution community, because in many places of the world that really matters to people, the fact that they're getting respiratory illnesses. It's very immediate, whereas climate is much more abstract. So I'm just going to stop there, and I'm just going to throw out the framing question to start our conversation, and then people should feel free to put a lot of questions in the chat. Let's see what we can get out of the next bit of time in terms of a really nice conversation. So again, thank you for this really, really important work. And maybe Maliki, I don't know if you, or Farida, if you wanted to start on the question of framing and narrative, and how did you shift, you know, the powers that be and get them to actually modify what they were doing based on the work you were doing together.
So thank you, Jackie. If I may just comment or two on this, يعني the presentation we talked about, for example, Cairo Ring Road, we gave the information and the insights based on an understanding of these operations and the passenger experience and so on. However, something like going back on not subsidizing new public transport projects, this comes from other experiences that were faced by the government. First of all, there was the launch of the light rail train a couple of years earlier, and the ticket price was X. I don't remember how much exactly, but and it was not subsidized. And there was no ridership at all, and it had to be cut in third or something like that, and people started using it. So I think reality forces itself sometime, and now, based on these experiences and other examples, decision makers are more cautious, hence the data, hence the study before implementation. They're more cautious about something in this particular case, like ticket pricing and you know, the changes introduced to the existing networks.
Yeah, if I may also jump in, I wanted to reflect on one of the points that Maliki mentioned towards the end, the concluding remark that as long as you have initial regulatory challenges, these will remain, even if you add in new, more modern public transport services. So one reflection is that inherently popular transport services, the regulations there are a bit challenging, because in fact there are two authorities involved. So you get licensed, at least in the case of Egypt, you get licensed by the governorate. However, the entity that is actually responsible for public transport services that are more formal is the Ministry of Transport. Both of these don't necessarily talk together. And for the governorate, licensing these popular transport services is very often a money-making business. So they don't see it as a public transport service that needs to be subsidized or where operators need to be compensated, but in fact it's a means to an end, so to say. So I think one of the main things that we need to focus on a bit more is to like really reconfirm that public transport is a public service. It needs to be provided by the public sector. It needs to be compensated for. And at the same time, this notion that as long as the quality standards aren't up to date and up to the user needs, please don't expect the situation to change. Like you can't keep talking. I mean, very often we know this also, governments don't always see the value of talking about the environmental pollution maybe or the air quality ramifications, but they do very much care about congestion because it has very direct economic impacts. So one thing that we've noticed is a powerful tool is to say, well, okay, if you want to attract a larger user base for public transport services, first, you need to ensure that they are up to standards, that they provide a comfortable experience, that they're fast, that they're competitive with private cars, which very many users do in fact have access to, even if proportionally they don't make up a very large amount of residents in many global South cities. And maybe one last point is also related to the environmental impacts. Age of fleets, that is also not, I mean, regulations often exist, but they're not enforced. And unfortunately, with many foreign exchange crises, as they like to call them here, and inflation issues, the political stance is often then, well, we can't afford to import or to build newer vehicles and to launch them. We would much rather reuse the current fleet. Even if it's not for public transport, we'll sell it off to another, business owner or personal driver. So that's also, I think, a challenge where we're often faced with in global South cities. I'll stop here so other speakers can also reflect. But thank you for the question, Jackie.
Yeah, I might just jump in quickly and say we need to have some economists and public health folks more integrated into these conversations, because some of the rising costs of air pollution on, for example, health costs, if you look at respiratory illnesses and if that, health care is publicly provided, you see that the costs are very high. Also, climate impacts can be very high. Crashes is the #1 killer of many people. That's also very high. So I think we're just not doing the cost benefit analysis. And I do think we need to also, I really appreciate you bringing out the used vehicle problem, where often the solution is just banning, imported vehicles in places like Africa. This is a whole area that we have to study, because now as we get more vehicles on the market from electrification, in other parts of the world, maybe there's opportunities to import used vehicles that have much higher emission standards, or, the other opportunity is to, also for public transit vehicles or shared mobility, provide, not tax them when you bring them into the country, for example. So there's a lot of different opportunities for creative policies that could be put in place to address some of these things. And I think we're not really talking about them enough. So I really appreciate you bringing them up. And I'm going to make a plea that maybe we should collaborate with some more economists and public health folks to really get a clear idea of what the cost benefit scene looks like. But I'm going to stop. I think someone else had a comment. Was that Mohammed?
Yes, thank you. I mean, as Farida mentioned, of course, for microbuses in Egypt in particular, many of them are recycled vehicles and older vehicles, because the import duties, in particular for these vehicles, are not getting any kind of exemptions. They're treated the same way as private vehicles, and that's also part of the problem, where In Egypt, we don't necessarily produce these kinds of vehicles, unlike private vehicles and buses. So in the in-between, which is actually the favorite kind of vehicle for paratransit or popular transit, is not actually being manufactured in Egypt, and therefore the only option is to import from abroad. And therefore, yeah, it becomes very difficult for this for people who own vehicles that are very old, who struggle in repairing and maintaining their vehicles, to actually replace them with newer vehicles.
Thanks so much. Is there anyone else who might have a comment or a question? I think a lot of people had to leave early today, so it's a smaller group today.
I could just jump in with a quick response.
for it,
That's
Jackie. I
okay.
know
So
you always
if there's space. Yeah, and I think that this idea of like maybe pushing for, preferential treatment for shared use vehicles could be connected to congestion argument. You could say that if we could make these vehicles much more attractive and safe, and we brought in the newer vehicles, then more people would be induced to use them, and that would help with our congestion problem. So I'm just like, I think that these are some of the things that we need to start exploring more.
Ariana, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, and Andrea, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in the case of Costa Rica, even though the import of cars is not, I mean, there are many new cars now on the street and also electric cars, so you would think that they pollute much less. The problem of congestion is still terrible. So I think definitely, and there is a widespread feeling of the citizens of frustration with that. So I just want add that in the context where you don't have, when you have an increase of imported cars but that are cleaner, you still have a strong argument on the congestion problem.
Yeah, I think that's definitely when just reducing emissions is not enough. If we just change vehicles and we just incentivize electrification and not make substantial transformational adjustments to the system, we will keep having more and more and more cars, even if they're electric. So we definitely need to go beyond that conversation of just electrification and and think about what makes the system work and have it be user focused. And that's definitely, I think, what we're trying to bring into this conversation, understanding the system, having public transport be understood and recognized as part of the system, and have policies that respond to this by integrating it, by making the integration more flawless, as Melegi was saying, for example, integrated ticketing, things like that. You might not think it's a decarbonization action, but if it makes the connection and the connectivity between the modes easier, people will have less of an excuse to go buy a car. So really, a lot of the work that needs to be done into the sector is about integration, about making the modes safer, more comfortable, better connected to each other, closer to people, etc. Because if not, people, if there's also a policy incentive to import electric cars, it will still be more attractive to buy an electric car or an electric motorcycle that's private than use shared mobility. And what we want to go towards is shared mobility or avoiding trips in general. So I think that's also a really important component of the conversation. What is policy incentivizing, right? So a lot of the countries are incentivizing creating incentives for imported vehicles to be cheaper, but they're private vehicles. They're not necessarily the vehicles that are being used for shared mobility. Just as context to all of you, we're going to be starting some work with certain countries to help them in their process to creating incentives and policy towards electrification to incorporate popular transport vehicles there and to figure out what are the necessary financial mechanisms and incentives that have to be there for the operators to be able to electrify, because it will be very different for a private owner user to make that shift than if an operator that has a business with these types of vehicles wants to change to electric and to improve their business. So we're going to be starting some work on that, and hopefully we will have some insights in a bit of time once we get on the ground. But yeah, the good part is that this conversation is ongoing, and the idea of these meet and greets is that we meet each other, learn from each other, and have on our top of our minds, oh, this was happening in Egypt, and I know this about Costa Rica, and so that we can kind of try to reduce that learning curve that is out there on how to reduce emissions, adapt, and achieve a just transition to the sector. We're about to close, so thanks again to you all. I know that people from the other side of the world, I'm based in Latin America, on the other side of the world, it's late, here it's early. So I know there's a lot of people making an effort to be here. So thanks all of you. Thanks to the speakers for taking the time to share your knowledge with us. And we will continue this conversation. We're actually going to do a next meet and greet in October, focusing more on the electrification component, because there's a lot going on there. There's several living labs in our network that are doing some research on that. And we also want to cross it over with other people in our network who are thinking about that just transition element and the business models, etc. So we'll continue the conversation in a couple of months and hope to see you all there. And for now, have good nights, good afternoons, and almost a good weekend. See you soon. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Bye.